محمد الذي تنحل به العقد وتنفرج به الكرب وتقضى به الحوائج وتنال به الرغائب وحسن الخواتيم ويستسقى الغمام بوجهه الكريم وعلى آله وصحبه في كل لمحة ونفس بعدد كل معلوم لك.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Ladies and gentlemen, as we are about to begin, let me do some housekeeping notes to ensure that this virtual event can run smoothly. First, I would like to remind those who are on the camera to dress appropriately. You are allowed to turn off your camera. However, please do not forget to turn it on at the end of the session for the photography session. Second, please prepare your questions and you may raise the question in the chat box and our speaker will answer them at the end of the session. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Honorable Prof. Dr. Shukran, Dean Kuliya of Islamic Review, Knowledge and Human Sciences, distinguished speaker, Honorable Dr. Mio Alif Mio Azlan, Department of Political Science, Deputy Deans, Deputy Director, Heads of Departments, Heads of Research, Professors, Associate Professors, Doctors, Academic Members, and last but not least, our young graduates and students. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Alhamdulillah, praise to be Allah. We are able to convene this morning to participate in HADISUS SOBAH, organized by the Abdul Hamid Abu Sulaiman Kuliya of Islamic Review, Knowledge and Human Sciences, International Islamic University, Malaysia. I am Muhammad Jifri Muhammad Arafat Kareem. I am having PhD in Fiqh and Usul al-Fiqh. And I am the Vice Chairperson of Research Bureau of the Reveal Knowledge and Human Sciences Graduate Society Lecture. and it is an honor to be the MC for this session. And on behalf of the Kulliyah, I would like to extend a very warm welcome to all of you. All right, before we go further, let us begin our program today with the recitation of al-Fatiha. Al-Kitab. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. إياك نعبد ونستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين آمين. Jazakumullah khairan. I would like to invite our Honorable Prof. Dr. Shukran Abdul Rahman, Dean Kulliyah of Islamic Review, Knowledge and Human Science, to deliver his remarks. Welcome,
Thank you very much, Brother Arafat. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen wa salatu wa salamu ala ashrafil anbiya wa mursalin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Rabbi shrah li sadri wa yassir li amri wa luqdatan min lisani yafqahu qawli. Amin. Amma ba'd. Dear all guests, Deputy Deans, Head of Department, especially to the speaker, Dr. Mir Alif, Mir Azlan from the Department of Political Science. Thank you very much for responding to our invitation to fill in the HADISUS SOBAH session today. Dr. Mir, the topic that we have given to you is a topic that we know is after your heart. And I still remember the responses that you provided to the rector when he interviewed you last time. I think the focus was on these higher education businesses, especially from the perspective of westernization, de-westernization, and also decolonization. And ladies and gentlemen, today we have the opportunity to listen to Dr. Mir Alif. Hopefully, after listening to him, we will know our businesses better, we will know our profession better, and we'll know the sector that we are serving better. Hopefully, we can position ourselves right in the business of higher education. Right. So thank you very much again, Dr. Mir Alif, and thank you very much to all participants for attending this HADISUS SOBAH. Over back to you, Brother Arafat.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Prof, for your initial remarks. Thank you so much. Before I hand over the session to Dr. Alif Mio Azlan, I would like to introduce him. Dr. Azlan is from Department of Political Science. He is going to deliver today a very important topic about decolonization of higher education. Before I hand over the session to him, let me inform you that he will be delivering his talk for 30 minutes, and we will open the session for Q&A for 15 minutes. So I would like to welcome Dr. Mio Alif Mio Azlan. فليتفضل مشكورا ومأجورا.
Alhamdulillah. Thank you very much. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Can you hear me? Is the audio clear?
Yeah, doctor. Yeah, doctor.
Thank you very much. Right. Thank you very much, moderator, Brother Jeffrey Arafat Karim, for the words of introduction. Esteemed attendees, Professor Dr. Shukran Abdul Rahman, Dean of Abdul Hamid Abu Sulaiman Kulliyah of Islamic Knowledge and Human Sciences, directors, deputy directors, heads of departments, beloved professors, senior colleagues, students of maybe a few, who knows, students, and the IM community at large. Thank you very much for the invitation and the opportunity to share from the bottom of my heart. Thank you very much for the invitation and the chance to speak. I am cautious as well as excited. Inshallah, I will try, endeavor my best to tackle what is blatantly a difficult and complex topic of discussion, certainly a watering hole for many individuals and a point of interest for many, from the young to the more elderly and so on. Please do not ask me questions as if, or later on, as if I'm a tried and tested and true expert just yet, if possible. I myself, at the beginning of my humble journey, also, if I stumble, my firstborn is about 3.5 weeks old, so I apologize if I stumble here and there, because sleep is a bit scarce. And in further qualifying my contribution and acknowledging my position, and of course my privileges, a kind of practice that I've noticed taking stage within decolonizing circles. I'm of course male, Malay, Malaysian as well. Okay, I will share my screen very quickly. Can you see it?
Yeah, it is visible. Yeah.
Okay. So I think you've been introduced to the topic, decolonizing in higher education. I am endeavoring to speak for about, as mentioned, 25 to 30 minutes or so. And my sharing today will consist of 4 parts. Oh, sorry. Is that the right? My apologies. Just 1 second, please. Okay, as you've noticed, I also speak about in class about high, middle to late medieval age before. Anyway, so now that we have the right deck, I'll speak about decolonizing higher education. My sharing today will consist of 4 parts. Right. I will begin with a kind of working answer to the question of number 1, what is the university or a university? Then I will proceed to speak a little bit on number 2, which is the question of what are some of the current estimations of the present situation with universities in general. And then I hope to move into speaking a bit on number 3, of course, the notion of decolonization in higher education. And finally, I will provide, of course, at the very end, a kind of modest vision of my own on what a future decolonized university of higher education may look like. And of course, here I will try and employ a little bit of my futures back lens to help in seeing presumably a clearer path forward, as many have done as well. Okay, that's clear. Four parts. So now to the first question. Although I'm sure many present here today need no reminding of what the general dimensions of a university consist of. I'm of course reminded of the story of the blind men, women as well, blind men describing the elephant. But it won't, of course, this won't hinder me from attempting to try and have a kind of working definition for this particular sharing session as well. So what is the university, right? Connell, 2019, puts it in these terms. Essentially, defines the university in the following terms. Essentially, it is technically any institution with the legal power to grant degrees or equivalent qualifications, either bachelor's, master's, doctorate, licentiate, and so on. Of course, the size and the complication of the global higher education sector and the multiple purposes that universities serve are, of course, major and confronting. And the power to grant degrees is not just a kind of formality. It has economic and social consequences for the student, of course, for the institution as well, and for the government. Right? And I'm sure as well that many of us are concerned and curious with the fair for higher education, especially its present form. Say about higher education in digestible terms for this discussion. What can we say in digestible terms for this sharing session? Here, I lean on KPMG's 2020 global estimation of how it views the future of higher education in a disruptive world. What are some of the estimations of the current situation with universities? Firstly, it is the case that ever since the Second World War, that globally on average, 1 in 3 young people now enter higher education. And of course, more than 3 in 4 do so in the northern portions of the world, in Europe and North America. However, the attainment rates of bachelor degrees among the young population are of course declining, and declining to 50% in many places, the rate of attainment of bachelor's degree. Many are, of course, already viewing a degree as not being even worth the money in future earnings, citing, of course, that they would be financially better off if they had not gone to university, if they skipped it. Right? And then you have issues like the degrees earnings premium that sort of in itself is declining. And sometimes the premium from presumably a degree adds up to a negative sum, a negative sort of premium. Over the past decade or so, attitudes towards higher education, of course, has shifted in these terms. The belief of a kind of decline in return for some kind of benefit at the end of higher education seems to be coinciding with other things, including with the increase of the cost of things in other spheres of life, right? And more particularly, the increase of cost of tuition fees alongside debt in every form, including, of course, student debt. So I guess one can, of course, imagine the difficulties one would face in situations where the cost of fees and cost of living is high, right? And then moreover, you add to this inefficiencies on the part of the university administration, contributing to driving up the cost, particularly in the context of a kind of race in providing amenities, campus experiences, in order to climb international rankings. Of course, on the point of international rankings, the tuition fee is an enticing source of funding for research, which, of course, research in return determines one's rank on such a list. Right? And then concerns of affordability in one form or another, certainly, of course, and further entrenches the paradox of poorer students being unable to pay fees or being unable to progress in the world due to the repayment of their debt in education. Of course, it is fortunate that in some societies, in some places in the world, perhaps Malaysia included, in some of these places, these societies are willing to pay for much of higher education. But it would perhaps only continue to do so if some kind of productivity seemed to increase or rise in parts of that society's economic sort of overall situation or wealth. And as the appeal of universities decline, the willingness of people in general to pay more than they already do will drop as well. And on a more sort of local rather than global view, the concerns of the appeal of the university and university education is mirrored. Now you add onto all of this the troubles of decolonizing and the appeals, or in the reverse direction, the loathing of not doing so. Huh? So it has come to pass, and here I move on to my third question. What's the first two, and then the third? It has come to pass. Higher education of our time is, in effect, confronted by the challenges of decolonizing. There is presently an acknowledgement that colonization and coloniality have impact on higher education practices and systems. Smith, Wathiongo, Mignolo all speak of this. Of course, decolonization can be understood as a signifier for the diverse, yet connected resisting efforts, each establishing and transforming, as well as redressing the historical and ongoing processes of racialization, colonization, all the while creating and keeping alive modes of knowing, being, and relating, which, of course, racialization and colonization seek to eradicate. This question of decolonization and higher education has brought the scholars of the South and the North, or even the South and the South, like it did in Kuala Lumpur in 2011, and then recently, last year, 2021, in IIUM as well, closer. Of course, in trying to inspect the processes and the ideas involved. A recent paper just published this year, 2020, Adafila et al. Is such an example of research into the topic, more contemporary sort of placing of it. Of course, such a challenge of doing so evidently engages scholars of varying and diverse and different disciplines, and calls for the involvement of many stakeholders and a kind of complex layering of discussions. Of course, there are still some who ridiculously, I would say ridiculously, trumpet the horn of gratefulness for colonization, and those who find it perhaps easier to adapt to previously colonized norms, previously colonized circumstances, practices, mechanisms, or institutions. You can imagine the internationalization. Excuse me. You can imagine the internationalization of engagement that you would require between Asian, European, Latin American, African researchers, who in general are typically split into two segments, between the historically oppressed and the other one, of course, the segment which has not experienced coloniality. Right? And then you also have those who are currently coping further. These are people who are in between notions of coping with powerlessness, with some sort of feeling of guilt, or with notions of white fragility, and difficulties and complexities in, put simply, redressing or addressing certain forms of coloniality, fearing rocking the boat, fearing the loss of knowledge production structures in damaging ways. They prefer instead to sort of move on and let bygones be bygones, because they fear that the existence of knowledge production structures would be damaged sort of irreversibly, and then what kind of situation will we have then? But there are, of course, those who stand firm on the point of social justice, right? And social justice as never having to lag behind any excuse on behalf of coloniality or colonialism. And this sort of circumstance I've just described is perhaps much due to the reality that the meaning of decolonization in education has multiple characterizations, and it tends to differ and vary among different epistemic variations, and of course the various people in diverse material, political, cultural, and economic as well, economic dimensions in different contexts. Of course, the discussion ultimately and the debate centering around decolonization is often controversial. Certainly, it's going to be in fashion. It is in fashion and will remain to be topical. So in this context, or in this sort of setting, how do I envision or imagine the decolonized university, particularly in the context of a decolonized higher education, perhaps to look for how it looks for, how it will look like for my son, my grandchildren, inshallah, our children, and so on. Here, of course, I will employ a little bit of, some of you are familiar, a kind of futures back sort of lens in seeing a kind of clearer path forward, as of course, again, many have done. And this strategy typically tries to forecast from the front backwards and onto today's circumstances and toward the future, of course, and any sort of, it tries to sort of envision any type of potential encumbrances, which of course ultimately will assist me in explaining how I've framed some of these personal visions and how I see the future sort of decolonized university to look like. Oh, bear with me. So the university of the future, by some new name or another, continues to exist. Right? It's alive, it's not dead. Why? Because it never chose not to do anything. Particularly, it chose to do, it didn't choose to do nothing to sort of change or transform. Arguably, where there is a collectively synchronized group of students, bar gender, wealth, origins, and constitution, eliciting any or a form of tutelage from a similarly collectively synchronized group of teachers, arguably the academy will persist. Where there's hunger for any form of knowledge, hunger for the form of knowledge itself, there will be food of thought to be fed to the hungry. The University of the Future will know how to conduct defiance and deference as well, and share it. It teaches ultimately the useless as it may lead to the useful, and will speak of the useful so it may navigate the useless. The University of the Future is recognizable, unrecognizable at the same time, recognizable and unrecognizable at the same time, in the same way its siblings of the past or any futures past, have existed, have lived, and will perform and eventually bow out. And of course, in the same way, these previous iterations are both familiar and unfamiliar to any contemporary view, contemporary eye. It will escape obsolescence, or it has escaped obsolescence by anticipating its own irrelevancy. It has taken to drive for itself the rate of change by actually making it. And it continues to undo and redo as it always has done. And alongside technology, it continues to build value each time, each new iteration with new capabilities. The University of the Future can be on the moon, on Mars, or on some station in space. It may even not need money anymore. It can exist, of course, in a way a garden or a park can be physically enjoyed, or enjoyed as it will in every hand, wherever that hand is rested and has some kind of capacity to access the university through some kind of interface of the time, without one ever having to lift a foot, of course a finger, but not necessarily a foot. Either way, you will be able to sit, stand, or lie down in its corridors and within its embrace. It may exist in hybrid form, where it's physically occupying as well, a kind of meta real estate that sullies the lines between what's indoor and what's outdoor. And after all, a university isn't just simply a facade. And this University of the Future has certainly found its footing in a kind of digital ecosystem, allowing it to continue with learning and knowledge creation. The University of the Future knew to step out of its insular world and that its place is in the unknown, particularly in order for those around it to know more. It's not this university is not the beginning, it's not the end or the middle point of a supply chain for the people huddled around it, precisely because it constitutes a kind of readily available experience, touching each of its members at every point, at some point in their lives. So it can't be. It can be neither too elite as well. It can be neither too elite nor too common, too corporate nor too stately, or absent too early nor too late. Of course, this university has found a way to be the synonym to learning as well, neither too formally nor too informally, whereby, of course, the act of going to university means both. Ultimately, if the university is cloistered and closed, then it cannot be open. The decolonized University of the Future understood that learning is not a career. It has avoided it has avoided being only defined by its ability to provide upward mobility to the few, while marginalizing the many who have equally walked their corridors. It will continue to be ultimately inextricably intertwined with issues of power, social class, and materiality, but it will also shape it. The University of the Future is not the place where the upper social classes reproduce themselves, nor will it be the place to underscore its own innate and inherent supremacy by excluding knowledge acquired outside the university and in communities. The University of the Future reproduces not just the automaton, which is the next generation of researchers, but it's also reproducing highly reflective practitioners. The university ultimately is learning anywhere from sort of everywhere. And the notion, I think this is also key, the notion of success and succeeding is no longer of success understood as a kind of colonial society. It has also understood to recognize that there's to be no one particular civilization that is innately superior over others as well. It had understood as well that learning was itself constrained and influenced by society, by cultural traditions, by worldly circumstances, and by forces of stability such as governments, libraries, and in fact even itself. But it also had to recognize that things like writing in its sort of various sort of forms are always limited by intentions, necessary assumptions, and of course imageries projected by those who stand behind the act of doing it. Of course, this University of the Future recognizes a knowledge and a power relation that gives privilege to only certain gazes in a global hierarchy of education. It had to recognize this. And it took the necessary steps in unpacking the impacts of colonization. And of course, had to identify alternative marginalized canons of knowledge in a kind of more diverse and more diversified curriculum, syllabus, and practices, and so on. The University of the Future as well allowed each individual their identity. The university enriches the university itself of enrichment and intermingled individuals. Had to understand to avoid the continuing replication of racist, ethnocentric, and worst of all, imperialist, regularized perspectives and representations or visions or writings, and of course the studying of other people. It did not ultimately, this decolonized university did not pass on from one scholar to another new scholar over many generations any theories or practices which serves as a kind of edifice of a system of knowledge which only seeks to strengthen a particular hegemony. Right? So in its course of filtering, it was able to recognize that things are typically constituted of entities devoid of very specific and fixed essences. And of course, that any kind of assertions made over something is only useful in its well-weightedness, and not due to some kind of innate self-proclaimed privileged perspective in which, of course, by whom and where typically influences the claim that was made. The University of the Future as well knows or knew how to date colonialism to as early as the end of the 15th century, and that there had been both non-Western as well as Western knowledge from day naught, from day zero. Right? It understood the contiguity, fluidity, and continuity of the constituting effects of colonial structures and institutions, and that the colonial condition is intimate with the imposition of universal epistemological Western, particularly West European logic of modernity. Of course, it knew to ask who is doing something, where, why, and how it's being done. Right. In the universities of the future, which of course has been decolonized in places like Asia, Africa, Latin America, and the rest of the world, it stands as a kind of bulwark of resistance, both of the East and the West, on behalf of the intellectual, political, economic, and cultural domination of the world, particularly by the West. It understands that there was no reason to suppose that anyone, for even a second's pause, would forget the thought that the colonizer and the colonized and their great-grandchildren would stop seeing each other as each other's absolute evil. To each side, the other side is corrosive, disfiguring, deforming, maleficence, right? And the university understood this. It understood that it possessed, or it had possessed, the privilege of being conversant in a kind of imperial culture, and was unable to disown it, despite understanding that it is an act of colonization in itself. And this university, of course, ultimately, decolonized one can be in English or in every language, or all language if it pleases. It brings ultimately as well, this decolonized university has brought movements like hashtag roads must fall, hashtag fees must fall, hashtag why is my curriculum white, hashtag liberate my degree. These types of similar movements has brought these movements to a kind of natural and rightful conclusion as it passes through the many events of the complex and sort of contested processes of unlinking itself from colonial ideas, infrastructures, and impulses. All right, to of course move towards the end. The University of the Future knew how to assert, imagine, voice, enable, center, decenter, embed, liberate, reconstruct, validate, transform, integrate, empower, self-determine, destabilize, interrupt, resist, challenge, dismantle, critically examine, deconstruct, question, uncover, and recognize in lieu of all of its challenges. It has avoided, of course, academic dependency at all costs. It's the university of enhanced diversity, as it is the university of Montesquieu, of Comte, of Marx, of Weber, of Said, as well as the University of Mencius, Farabi, Khaldun, Rizal, Saka, Alatas, and so on. The University of the Future, of course, no longer lifeless and pale imitations of Western universities. They're significantly creative in their contributions, as well as closely in touch with their local communities and environments. It knows to connect between civilizations and their histories and learn to build and accumulate from these histories in order for the creation of a more harmonious nexus within each particularities for the purpose of knowledge and wisdom. So to conclude, I would like to share a few more words as a call of action from this point on. I of course believe as educators in higher education, for however long my career as well will last, I believe as educators in higher education, we have a continuous role to play. And despite the complexity of the issues we have to grapple with, there are things that we can do. There are actions that we can take individually. And here I've highlighted 5 such suggestions. And presumably this will allow us to respond and sort of take the early steps. Number 1, of course, to continue to reflect and understand decolonization. And then, of course, to continue to examine, as Prof. Dr. Shukran as well has mentioned, continue to examine our own discipline and interest in light of decolonization. And then where possible, and of course, certainly where necessary, identify previously marginalized and alternative canons and bodies of knowledge and try and sort of carry this forward with you. And of course, finally, perhaps to have some sense of one's own future of what a kind of sort of decolonized university or higher education looks like. And of course, it begins to sound like it's asking too much, but finally, to attempt or to make attempts in diversifying our approaches, particularly in avoiding colonial expectations and standards. I think I'll end on this note. We'll put a pin on it here, and I think we'll take questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Alif Miro Azlan, for your great explanation and sharing your thoughts regarding today's topic. Thank you so much. So we are going to move on to question and answer session. If there are any questions, please unmute yourself. Thank you so much. Floor is yours. Okay.
Assalamualaikum.
Walaikum salam. Welcome.
My name is Zainal from Political Science Department. Okay. I'll proceed with the questions, or should I? Okay, Mio. Thank you so much, Mio. It's really amazing to once in a while here. I hope that we have this kind of a discussion over our academic staff lounge, whatever. But let me go straight to the point of reality. While decolonizing is definitely a mission of our university, and we know the kind of discourse behind, and you further summarized and highlighted it very well. But now let's go back to questions to the elephants in the room. Whether, as a university, International Islamic University, are we the agents for decolonizing, or we are the agents of colonizing? So just want to see your perspective on this, whatever that's been talked about at the management upstairs, really get into the discourse among the academics in the faculty or in the Kuliah.
Just to be clear, the question was, are we agents of decolonizing or colonizing?
Yes, correct. I just want
to okay, good. Yeah, okay. Thank you, Dr. Zainal. Anything else?
That's all. That's enough. That's enough.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Okay, Brother Arafat, do we take more or do we?
No problem. You can answer. Thank you so
good. Okay. I particularly like this question because it highlights a kind of paradox, a kind of tension that exists in the what do you call it? In the dynamics of the dynamics that exist between a colonizer and a colonized, right? Because there's a position out there which goes something like the colonizer wants to be loved by the colonized, but at the same time he hates the fact that he has this urge to be seen by someone who is inferior to him, needing someone inferior sort of affections and sort of respect and things like this. So that's on the side of the colonizer. And then on the other hand, the colonized as well feels a bit funny about his or her situation as well, because he dislikes or she dislikes or detests this dynamic between colonizer and colonized, but at the same time, in trying to displace the colonizer, it tends to be that he takes up the position of the colonizer himself, because it seems like he has to become the colonizer to replace the colonizer, to be a kind of substitute to the colonizer. So on both sides, there's a kind of self-loathing on the side of someone who is colonizing, and then on the side of someone who's being colonized. You loathe the other person, but you secretly want to be the other person as well. Right? That's the weird paradox. And of course, this tension arises from a kind of dynamic where things tend to not be equally understood. Right? It's more along the point of wherever you find a kind of hegemony, you will certainly find individuals who are immediately displaced or marginalized from that sort of, to borrow, maybe a more familiar sort of term, from the kind of in-group, right? Because certainly any kind of, again, the postmodernist sort of view that any kind of hegemonic narrative tends to immediately exclude things outside, and it makes it very clear that there are people who will be marginalized and outside of a particular situation. As IEM academics, I think the question is less about labeling ourselves as either colonizers or decolonizers. I think it's more about understanding that this tension and this dynamic occurs, particularly when we forward a certain vision. Why? Because the first step to perhaps the first step to decolonizing is to diversify. In other words, to I think I mentioned earlier, to allow the university to have a kind of open embrace, right? And perhaps one of the biggest reasons to do so is that leveraging on this openness will allow us to, of course, as I mentioned earlier, lean more on previously marginalized or previously ignored, currently in the present, alternative forms and bodies and sources of knowledge, right? Beyond simply the ones that we are sort of familiar with. So if I could perhaps borrow a metaphor, I would say presently, of course, by the efforts of our forefathers and the great thinkers before us, and this very university, walking the same corridors, I mean, their efforts, of course, have pushed the door, so to speak, ajar, right? And perhaps the role now is to keep it either slightly open or completely sort of open in order for more things to come and pass through it. It's of course a monumental task to ensure that the door is not shut to other continents beyond Europe. Again, when we say marginalized, we don't take it lightly. When we say marginalized, we're talking about a kind of tri-continental marginalization, the African continent, Asia in general, and then the rest of the world as well. So it's a monumental task. But again, we'll try, inshallah. We'll get there. I don't have a silver bullet, but I think that's the best I can do.
You have been very polite. I was just very diplomatic.
Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. Dr. Fatmi is raising his hand. Welcome, Doctor. Welcome.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you very much, Brother Arafat. And Dr. Mayor, I was following your presentation. Perhaps you have heard even people are talking about universities without buildings, They want universities without physical existence. Now, that is based on studies or based on someone's prediction. Now, our concern is about the quality, because when we look at what we have gone through these 2 years, that we had this online or virtual way of teaching. So based on my experience, I have seen that the quality is not there, and what we expected or what we used to get when we had face-to-face, it was different, you know. I think it was very low compared to what we were before. So do they think about this? I mean, and another thing that is about the social relationships that we have with people. Do you think that this distance learning or universities without physical existence will facilitate that compared to what we have? And if we go back according to our history, Muslims at the beginning started, I mean, this they call this the visiting the sheikh, but that was a physical contact with the sheikh beginning, and later on they established universities, you know. And only recently we have this idea that okay, we would like to have universities without physical existence. So what will be your reflection on that? Perhaps you can give some of your views. Thank you very much.
Just clarify two questions, one on assessment and quality,
Yes.
and then the other one on physical universities, right?
Yes,
right?
yes.
Okay, thank you very much again. I appreciate it. And your attention as well. Thank you very much.
Welcome.
I think I will try and answer question one first, which is physical existence, and then I'll say a bit about assessment. The question of where a university can be, I think, is in a sense it's timeless, but it also moves with the progression of technology as well, right? Because let's be honest, like the basic of teaching and learning is simply just time. You add to the time a teacher and a student. Right? So where there's a pocket of time and there's someone who is carrying a kind of weight of information, and then there's someone who's willing to take it off that person in a kind of training or questioning fashion, or some kind of Socratic dialogue over this, questioning something and then providing an answer and taking it from there. This one is timeless, and I think I mentioned it as well in my presentation. But the change in terms of technology seems to be inevitable, particularly when we consider perhaps the necessity of it, because sometimes it doesn't come down to a question of choice. It comes down to a question of safety and necessity, because why were we forced to not be physical anymore? Sometimes it's a question of an actual concern for safety and a bigger sort of concern, a maslahah, a bigger sort of interest. So it's not really a choice. Of course, given the choice, different individuals perhaps will use differently. But it just so happens that there are instances where we will have to somehow change our practices and change our way of doing things. But the changes, whether it be having it online or having it physical, or again, there's no reason to suggest that perhaps we won't have a university on Mars. The interest is there and it's entirely possible as well. That'd be interesting because it'll be a kind of bioplanetary sort of Department of Political Science, Mars branch of Mars campus. That'd be interesting, well within the realm of possibility. But that adaptation is unavoidable. So I think the teacher or the educator is brave anyway. He can conduct a class while he's standing up, or he can conduct a class while he's walking, while he or she is walking over a coffee, or so the timelessness of the practice sort of guarantees or ensures that whatever the technological changes occur, you are guaranteed some kind of basic core sort of interplay between again, time, and then the two sort of 2 or 3 or 4 individuals involved. And again, there are trade-offs either way. Some people say, well, the younger generations are sort of more interested in sort of not really being in the room, but also at the same time still be in the room. These are, again, generational changes, of which it will come to pass anyway. Even the most, again, we know technology definitely sort of has a kind of shelf life regardless. So even if we say we have the most sort of advanced way of, as I mentioned earlier, kind of meta sort of real estate, even this, the one that we think which is most sort of futuristic, will at some point become obsolete as well. So I think the concern with change is valid, but the timelessness of the basic activity of it guarantees that ultimately students and educators will find a way, because again, it's actually knowledge finding its way through individuals instead of the other way around. So it will find its way one way or the other. And then of course there's the question of assessment, right? The question of quality and how can we, is the processes, my instinct is to say, at the beginning of the implementation of any new thing, particularly something which looks advanced enough that sometimes you can regard it as sort of like magic, right? At the beginning of implementing anything in general, there's always a kind of teasing stage. I suppose you call it a kind of teasing sort of period of dealing with how to sort of assess and go about increasing quality. But the question of assessment is a kind of colonial question as well. Why? Because this notion of going to university and then doing very well at a kind of privileged and elite institution, and then being rewarded for it, and then having upward mobility as a result of passing through a kind of elite structure, is a kind of colonial mindset as well, right? Because think about what the university used to look like. It certainly was, I think I mentioned in my presentation as well, it only rewarded a kind of elitism, a kind of self-reproduction, notwithstanding the fact that there are infinitely many students who also do the same thing. They go through the same processes, yet they don't enjoy the same upward mobilities that only a selected few achieve. Right? So it's a kind of doubles of elitism. Number one, you know, it's hard enough to get into it, and then number two, only a portion of people eventually enjoy upward mobility, and then they get rewarded, and then of course they join some kind of civil service, or in the past they would be rewarded by a good career and so on. But this, of course, isn't. I think I mentioned this is learning as a career. Right? So learning is not a kind of career. Assessments have to be sort of reflective. Has to do less with rewarding this kind of superiority, a kind of elitism. It should be more about, as I mentioned, sort of making more reflective practitioners more than anything else.
Thanks, Doctor.
I think that's my time. Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Fadmi.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Yeah.
Yes, sir. Due to time concern, we are going to conclude with Dr. Azizan only. Dr. Azizan is yours.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you, Dr. Mio. I enjoyed your presentation, but I canceled my raising my hand because I have a meeting now. But anyway, my question is very simple. Is a truly decolonized university is possible in future, given the complexity of the changes and also situation, including the complexity of what we call colonization and colonialism and coloniality and so on. That is number one, because you can never know exactly whether what we call colonization has been, of course, it is there, but the level of colonization might not be measured exactly, and we don't know. And number one, is a truly what you call it, decolonized university possible? The university that you have characterized it with all these characteristics. And number two, you don't mention the future. How distant is the future? Within near distant or very distant future or very near future? Because many predictions are subject to the conditions and also situations that take place. For example, many people have made prediction before 2019, but with COVID-19 issue, many predictions have not come to true. So how, this is my question. Thank you very much.
Okay, just to clarify 2 questions. Can we truly decolonize? Thank you, Dr. Azizan, for Azizan. I appreciate it. Number one, can we truly decolonize given the complexities?
No, is a truly decolonized university possible in future?
Possible, yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. And the other one, how distant, right? Is it near?
Yeah.
Or is it far?
What is your definition of future?
Yeah, good question. I appreciate it. Okay. So for the first one, I think, is it possible? Because this is the issue with people trying to get other people to do other things as well, which they previously perhaps wouldn't necessarily have done. Obviously people will say, would it be possible to truly decolonize? In my opinion, I think the question of whether it's possible to truly decolonize is actually, in reality, a weaker question than the question that was posed to our forefathers, which is the question of, is it possible to gain independence? Is it possible to break away? Or imagine or envision a kind of situation where colonialism is in reality. In fact, it's so entrenched that there's not even a thought that perhaps there wouldn't be any colonial masters in the first place, as if that particular idea lies beyond sensibilities. It doesn't even occur to the minds of those who actually had to push the material and physical tide of colonialism. I think this one is a much stronger and much more daunting proposition. Is it possible to envision a situation where we are not subjects or we're not sort of part of this actual reality? Right? So in my mind, I would say yes, it would be possible to decolonize the university and generally speaking, bring this side of the colonialization to its natural progression or end, precisely because we've seen that the changes in the more difficult changes in the material reality has come to fruition, right? Because again, don't think about the generations who were closer to independence, because perhaps they would certainly have entertained some thoughts along the lines of what would it look like, or would it be possible to have something beyond colonialism? But think about the generations who came before that. Certainly, they wouldn't have even seen it to be even logical or within the realm of sensibilities in the first place. So I think it's an easier, more manageable, and much more achievable question. That's number one. Number two is the question of how distant, near or far. I think here, I don't suppose we are speaking about anything near or immediate, precisely because we've outlined or we've taken on for ourselves, and as you've alluded to in the first question as well, certain difficulties and certain complexities. But it's ultimately a kind of iterative sort of process. If only it was as easy as a kind of arms struggle that you just take up arms and then immediately within the field of intellectualism, things will change sort of overnight if you had the know-how and the ability to plan for something like this. But of course, that's not the case. It will have to be a kind of iterative and gradual process. So I think I mentioned earlier that the key is not to reproduce over and over again, simply just automatons or people who just sort of researchers who are just replicating paradigms of the past, handed down from one teacher down to a new scholar like myself and then down to someone else. It shouldn't be this way. It should be a kind of relay race where constant iterations and constant sort of ideas are built upon. And of course, what we owe to the next generation is to, at the very least, lay a kind of basic groundwork, nurture some preconditions and build up some conditions so that the next generation doesn't have to do it. And then their job or their task is to do the next thing along the line. And you move that much closer to, to this endpoint. I hope that answers it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. We have come to the end of the program. On behalf of the organizer, I would like to thank our Honorable Dr. Mio Arif, Mio Azlan, for inspiring us, young researchers and students, on our roles and responsibilities. We hope that everyone will embrace and uphold your words of wisdom in their journey to be successful academics and researchers in the future. I wish the organizers, the participants, all the best, and may Allah bless our effort in this journey of knowledge. Before we end, let's turn on our camera so we can take photo. Please smile, everyone. I'm going to count down. Okay. Please turn on your camera. Okay, okay. 1, 2, 3. It's okay. Thank you so much. Before we end, okay. Thank you very so much. Let's end with this istighfar. Surah Al-Asr. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. والعصر إن الإنسان في خسر إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر. جزاكم الله خيرا. شكرا جزيلا.
Shukran. Thank you very much.
Thank
Dr.
you,
Mio,
Doctor. Thank you.
and my
Thank you very
beloved
much, everyone.
moderator, my
Thank you very much, Dr.
Thank you for your time. Thank you for your time.
Thank
Thank you very much, everyone, for your time.
you. شكرا.